Hello and welcome back to Understanding Pliosaurs with Dr. Judith Sassoon. Welcome to episode 2. Today we will be exploring pliosaur anatomy. This series is sponsored by the Ruskin Mill Trust, who are an educational charity based who operate in England, Scotland and Wales. They offer exciting outdoor learning environments and utilise practical land and craft activities to support the development of work and life skills in young people with autism and other learning difficulties. I will be your host, Ash Hall, and for this series I am joined by Dr. Judith Sassoon, paleobiologist and pliosaur expert from Bristol University.
Hello, and thank you very much for asking me.
Following on from episode 1, where we discovered what a pliosaur is, we will be exploring pliosaur anatomy, excluding the skeletal structure, which we will cover in another episode. Make sure to check out episode 1 if you haven't already. So let's get started. Judith, can you please tell me about the basic body structure of a pliosaur?
So thanks for asking that question. The basic body plan of the pliosaur we only know from skeletal structure, so it's quite tricky to exclude the skeletal structure totally from a conversation about anatomy. But I do understand that we're going to be trying to get into some sort of understanding of the soft tissue structures. That's probably worth saying that soft tissue structures are rarely preserved as fossils. We have a lot of information missing on those, certainly from the pliosaurs. However, we do have a few clues, and I'll certainly touch on those during our conversation. But anyhow, we can start by making some inferences as to what the pliosaur looked like. I will, of course, refer to the basic skeleton. I have to, because that provides the information of their shape, about their shape. So we're looking at creatures with quite large, maybe triangular-looking skulls or looking heads. These heads were proportionately maybe 1/5 of the total size of the pliosaur, maybe 1/6. They are full of teeth. The jaws are a little bit crocodilian, but full of very large teeth, at least towards the front of the jaws, gradually getting smaller towards the back. The eyes would have been slightly towards the front and to the side of the head. But the head is rather flat, so the pliosaur would have been able to see, if it pushed its head above of the water, it would have been able to see across the water. But the head is streamlined, so that would help also with the swimming, the pliosaur, which was part of the pliosaur lifestyle. So it's quite hydrodynamic. Moving a little bit further, so the pliosaur necks, to some degree, would be considered short relative to plesiosaurs. But in terms of the number of vertebrae that they had, perhaps they wouldn't necessarily be considered short. But what is interesting about those is that the vertebrae that make up the neck are quite short and compact. So we can call them short-necked creatures. So large head, slightly shorter neck than plesiosaurs. And then the rest of the body, quite large, maybe turtle-like in its overall structure. The fins, so we have two pairs of fins. We have at the front slightly shorter fins than the posterior fins. So we have an animal that clearly would have had quite a bit of, would have generated quite a lot of power from its hind limbs when swimming. And the tail also is relatively short compared to let's say, crocodiles or lizards. So sort of maybe, if you sort of try to flesh it out, something maybe a little bit turtle-like in some ways.
So, by the sound of things, you've sort of described something that's a bit like a whale with the flippers of a turtle and the head of a crocodile.
Maybe something like that. Yes, I think so. It's really rather hard to flesh out what the neck would have been like and how that would have been there may have been quite a lot of substance there. Plus the fact that they might have had quite a lot of, not blubber, but something like that, perhaps some sort of insulating material as well.
So now we've established a basic body plan, we can start exploring more complex discussion points that we have lined up. So, Judith, what was the skin like? Was it covered in scales like crocodiles, or denticles like sharks, or something else, or something in between?
Okay, so again, a tricky question because of the preservation capacity of skin and integument. For a very long time, we made guesses at what sort of skin an animal such as a plesiosaur or a pliosaur might have. But in recent times, there have been some preserved soft tissue that have been studied intensively by various scanning techniques and microscopic techniques. And in a very recent conclusion is that the skin of this would have been plesiosaurs. So we have no skin remnants from pliosaurs, but the skin of plesiosaurs was fairly smooth, which would make sense because that would, of course, make hydrodynamic sense. It would help them to move through the water. But the skin was generally quite smooth, so pretty scaleless, apart from some scales on the limbs. So the limbs would have had a sort of trailing edge, and that seems to... So there are suggestions that would have been scaly. So we're thinking of animals with a sort of fairly smooth, sort of general, or generally smooth skin, but with some suggestion of scales. So if we imagine turtles, and they have scales throughout, but some of the scales are larger than others. So perhaps we can sort of make some kind of imaginative guess as to what these animals look like, with some smooth parts and some scaly parts.
Okay, so another prehistoric reptile, the ichthyosaurs, we have skin here. And that shows some patterns of texture on the skin. So when you say smooth, do you sort of mean smooth to the touch, like a flat surface that we have manufactured type smooth, or are you talking smooth regarding objectively, kind of within nature, comparatively smooth to a scaly surface? Because you look at a shark, they look smooth, but they don't feel smooth.
No, sharks are pretty bumpy, actually. Yeah. I wouldn't be able to say. I would suggest smooth, but in whatever capacity that I don't know.
Yeah.
I would say smooth.
Yeah. So objectively looking at it, they're smoother.
Whatever
than,
is makes hydrodynamic sense. Yeah.
So almost like a dolphin. Then it looks smooth, but
Perhaps.
chances are there is a skin texture there.
Oh yes, that's fairly likely. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So an odd question for you while we're on the topic of skin, and this is from a colleague of mine, Emily, who works front of house here at the museum. Did pliosaurs have nipples?
Right. So here we're heading into quite an interesting area of what structures are associated with the skin of the vertebrates. So here again, we need to go back in history to the evolution of mammals. So as far as we know, the only creatures that developed nipples, which are related to glands, would have been the mammals. Today, the only animals that have these structures are the mammalia. This is because nipples are skin glands, and in history, in the history of life, it was the mammals who retained skin glands from the common ancestor of the reptiles and the mammals, and developed also the hairs that we know are characteristic of mammals. And skin glands, or sweat glands, for example, are associated with hairs. Mammals also have scent glands, and the nipples are, in fact, a development of these glands. Now, reptiles, that group, they lost most of these skin glands, which may have been a feature of the common ancestor. And what we're left with today is for example, in birds, if we consider them part of the reptiles, the sauropsid group, which includes birds, they only have one gland left, which is in the tail, which enables the birds to keep their feathers oily and in good shape. And in other reptiles, you sometimes have glands which signal to other reptiles, are sort of a reproductive signal to other reptiles. So there are fewer glands skin-associated glands in reptiles and birds than there are in mammals. And this also seems to be one of the sort of associated features of why mammals developed a certain number of integumentary features which are unique to them, including the hair and the glands, and why the reptiles developed feathers and scales, but lost glands.
Well, I guess that answers that then. And regarding nipples, we will come back to that when we talk about nursing in a future episode discussing pliosaur behaviour. So, if we're talking about skin structures like that, you mentioned glands.
Yes.
So another common gland that we have as mammals are around our eyes, which brings me on to the topic of eyes. We have eyelids and, by extension, eyelashes. Did pliosaurs
have eyelids?
Eyelids
Perhaps
and
is the first
eyelashes,
question. So let's think about eyelids first. So reptiles do have eyelids. Many of them do. Snakes do not, but turtles do. So let's think about the two obvious analogues for plesiosaurs and pliosaurs. We'll think, let's say, of the sea snake as one analogue. So they don't have lids. Instead, snakes seem to have lost the lids that used to protect their eyes. And instead they have a scale which is called a spectacle, which covers the eye and protects it against any sort of rubbish that might be sort of heading in their direction as they swim. The turtles, on the other hand, have eyelids, and so they're able to properly close their eyes. So that's perhaps the slightly better analogue for the plesiosaurs and pliosaurs. But turtles do not have eyelashes in general, with the exception, it's a snapping turtle. I think it's the alligator snapping turtle, which has small filaments as a sort of fringe around its eye. Now, as I mentioned before, hairs are uniquely mammalian structures. They are made of alpha keratin, and the reptiles do not have that sort of structure. They have scales and feathers and fibrous structures, but the fibrous structures are chemically different from the hairs of mammals. So the fibers that would make up these fringes around the snapping turtle's eyes are not hairs, but nevertheless are perhaps functioning as the eyelashes would in a mammal. So snapping turtles have fringes, but they are not sea turtles, and sea turtles do not have fringes, and I would suggest that fringes might somehow not be the best kind of structure to have if one is swimming in water. So I would guess that the pliosaurs probably had lids, but not fringes around the lids. What they probably would have also had, though, to protect their eye when swimming is something called the nictitating membrane, which is something that many creatures have, including the mammals and including many of the reptiles, including turtles. And that is a protective structure for when one is swimming, and it also enables the animal to see underwater as well as above the water if it needs to look at things in the air.
Is that membrane that you just mentioned the same thing we refer to as a third eyelid in dogs?
Yes. So dogs and cats have it.
Yeah. And we used to, and it's what
we
have.
So we have, it's called the sort of semilunar membrane.
Yeah.
If we look to one side, it's quite close to the nose, to that corner of the eye, and it's there. You can see it, but we don't use it to cover the eye at any point. Whereas many vertebrates, and that is both mammals and reptiles, do use such a structure.
Wonderful. And assuming the alligator snapping turtle's fringes is probably down to environment, as you said, being that they're on kind of riverbeds and soupy, muddy environments, it's probably more useful.
I'm not absolutely sure of the lifestyle of the alligator snapping turtle, to be fair. I'm not sure that they're not terrestrial, to be fair. I really don't know, actually.
We'll leave that one there then. We'll come back to hair, because I have questions. But while we're on eyes, pliosaurs had a third eye.
Yes.
Can you tell me what sort of thing that would be? And again, while we're on the topic of eyelids, would it be a visible surface structure with a membrane over the top, or would it be subdermal?
Interesting. I think that so the parietal eye, which is a feature of a number of creatures today, but not that many, actually, to be fair. Some creatures, some reptiles. So the tuatara is one of the animals that has such a structure. It's a structure which is found at the top of the head, between the parietal bones. It's an opening. It's covered in skin, and it seems to be a light-sensitive structure. So it is an opening into the skull, into the pineal area, and it seems to allow the animal to assess day length, and possibly regulate seasonal behavior, so possibly reproductive behavior. It is certainly present in plesiosaurs and pliosaurs. We do see an opening between the parietals. We have no idea as to what the soft tissue structure of that organ would be like, but I think it would be fair to say that it is likely to be to have a similar function as it might in the tuatara, but also as I need to sort of draw a rather peculiar analogue here. So if one goes to the leatherback turtle, leatherback turtles, they don't have a parietal opening. However, on the top of their skulls, they have a little pink patch. And the skull beneath that is much thinner. And these patches seem to allow light through, and the light then is detected by the pineal area of that animal's brain, and it regulates its seasonal behavior. So even though leatherback turtles don't have an opening, they nevertheless are light sensitive at the top of their heads. So pliosaurs did have an opening, but I think that might be exactly what that structure was for, this parietal eye, this third eye.
Okay, so you've mentioned kind of the assumed purpose, but from a general public view, I suppose, if you were on a boat and one swam past, would you see a third eye on the top of their skull, or would it appear non-existent?
Well, it may be that I don't know. It would, if you're imagining the leatherback, it's dark except for that small patch of pink. So the pink, it's not pigmented, but it is covered in skin. In fact, it's also covered in bone. I think that it's very likely that the structure was covered in skin in the pliosaurs. Whether it was coloured or not coloured, I couldn't guess. But pigmentation would obviously reflect light, so perhaps it would have been an unpigmented patch.
So presumably, though, there would be a visual indication that there is a difference.
Something there. Yeah, I would think perhaps that there would be some visual indication.
So presumably you'd be able to see something,
yes,
whether you knew what it was or not.
Think so.
As an onlooker of a pliosaur, you'd see something. Okay, so we're going to go back to hair.
Mm-hmm.
I will no doubt get the keratins mixed up because there is alpha keratin proteins and beta keratin proteins.
Yeah.
I can't, for the life of me, remember which one is which.
Okay, I can tell you. What I know is that the alpha keratin is the basic one, is the one that is present in both mammals and reptiles, or mammals and sauropsids. I think I should say sauropsids because then I can include birds in it. So an alpha keratin chemically is a helically structured protein. And that was probably already present in the synapsids. And even though some of the early synapsids were probably not hairy, the later ones did develop hair at some point, and this alpha keratin is associated with hair-like structures in the mammalian line. Reptiles developed, in addition to alpha keratin, another kind of keratin called beta keratin, which is chemically structured more like pleated sheets. So it's chemically slightly different in its three-dimensional structure. And that is associated with the integumentary appendages such as scales and feathers.
Okay. So this is where I'm going to hopefully challenge you, I suppose. And it's going to be a bit of a long-winded route to get to the main point. But you're talking about the simpler keratin being the hair-like structures, and this beta keratin being the more laminated forms. But if you look at us, we have fingernails.
Yes.
Where do they fit?
So the structures such as claws and nails in mammals are alpha keratin based, and similarly claws and that sort of thing, they don't so much have nails, I don't think. The hooves and this sort of thing in the reptilian line, there are some hoofed crocs, for example, are associated with both alpha and beta keratin.
Okay, so did you just mention scales in mammals there? You did, didn't you?
I didn't mention scales in mammals, but there are mammals that have developed scaly-like structures, yes. They are alpha keratin based.
So the armadillo, for example.
Yes.
That's alpha keratin.
Yeah.
And
pangolin, yeah.
yeah. So that whole group is okay. So if we look at the horn of a rhinoceros, it's keratin again.
Yeah.
That alpha keratin as well.
Yes.
That's interesting. So, well, I always knew it was assumed the same sort of keratin, but because of the density difference and the form difference between rhinoceros horn, our fingernails, and our hair, you'd assume there'd be some kind of, especially with the fact that fingernails do also seem laminated, like that lamination that you mentioned with beta keratin.
Mm-hmm.
But if we both develop keratin and we are effectively, I wouldn't say more evolved, but undergone a longer time period of evolution than plesiosaurs did, because mammals have been going evolutionarily from about the same time, where the lineage split from that common ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
And reptiles are the ones that seem to have evolved a second form of keratin, and we have the simpler form. Is it not entirely plausible that you could have had a hairy reptile?
Certainly some reptiles, maybe pterosaurs, developed fibre-like structures, which some people think are a little bit like early feathers or simple feathers. I think that's perfectly reasonable to suggest that might have been convergent structures, which were a little bit like hair. But they couldn't really be called hair-like in the mammals. That doesn't seem to be the case. Because that would mean that the alpha keratin would have to... But the beta keratin would have to be lost or something, and the alpha keratin would sort of re-emerge as hair. I mean, it's possible, but it's slightly less likely. We can't really say very much more than that.
Fair enough. Well, for those of you listening, just as a little kind of side note, it is worth mentioning that it is not just a solely mammalian feature that is hair, that we as mammals are the only ones that have this hair-like structure. It's also a case where, as far as I'm aware, every mammal at some point in its lifespan exhibits hair growth.
Yes.
Even the marine mammals.
Indeed.
So
yes.
whisker-like structures and things like that.
So it's a very, very classic and very, very typical feature of the mammals.
Yeah.
Hair.
So
hair and glands, that seems to be the two features which are very characteristic of mammals.
Because you see reports, articles, scientific articles and new discoveries all the time with more and more feather-like structures and more hair-like fibres, particularly if we're talking about the Cambrian age, kind of late Jurassic. You've got a pterosaur called Swordes Pliosaurs that exhibited those sorts of fibres that you mentioned. And it just seems curious that, as I said, with all that evolutionary benefit that I can't attest to, I suppose, the cold living animals of the Mesozoic, like we have here in the current evolution that we exist, where you have Arctic foxes and polar bears that need a layer of warmth there. But I know that a lot of documentaries, specifically the sorts of BBC focused ones where they discuss behaviour or show characteristic behaviour within dinosaurs, like to picture them and posit them in cold environments. But I guess that comes back to thermoregulatory behaviour as opposed to the development of thick feather-like structures or hair.
They seem to have had feathers, feather-like structures or simple feathers, some of them, yeah. The dinosaurs, I mean.
Yeah. It's a strange one because this is where I suppose we verge a bit from the pliosaurs, in that dinosaurs are curious because they get lumped together, the sauropods, the theropods, and I can't remember what the other group is. But we lump them together, but there's a very, very big gulf in their characteristics, where like these feathers occur in some and don't in others, and there are scales in some and armor in forms within the Stegosaurid group, and even some of the predatory dinosaurs have armor of forms, whether it's thick scales or whatever. And then you have theropods which evolved into birds and show us the feathers that we see around the world today. So it's amazing to see that kind of keratin diversify into so many different forms, I suppose, where you've got convergent evolution of scales within mammals and hair-like structures and feather-like structures, and it's all effectively from the same protein, be it a variation of the same protein.
Yes, I mean, that is quite incredible. And what we don't know really is to what degree they were coloured, to what degree they also, how much of their bodies were covered by scales or feathers, unless we have soft tissue fossils. So really what we have to be doing is waiting for the fossils to turn up to tell us more.
Okay, sweeping question, I suppose, and obviously not answerable to any level of detail. There's a lot of convergent evolution across all animals. We all come from a common ancestor 400 or so million years ago. Was it the Sarcopterygian fish? Very similar to the coelacanth, if I remember rightly. That kind of family, anyway. So we will exhibit commonalities. Are there commonalities that we assume within the organ structure of these animals, being that we're on soft tissue?
Presumably the animals had hearts. I mean, the pliosaurs and plesiosaurs had hearts, and presumably they had a circulatory system very much like most vertebrates. So yes, I'd say that it probably had much of the expected vertebrate soft tissue internal anatomy, yes. Digestive systems, nervous system, and so on, yeah.
Yeah, so just trying to picture it as a human being and what I have, I suppose the commonalities there are much the same in the way they function. Apart from, presumably, within this group, they exhibit a cloaca like most reptiles
like
do.
Most reptiles, yes.
So,
and they had lungs, obviously,
yeah.
yes, and
then
they were air breathers.
I guess unless we find some more, or we
Mm.
manage to excavate the body of ours and it turns out to have soft tissue,
Oh, that would be splendid, wouldn't it?
that we just won't know any more for a while, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, that probably wraps us up for episode 2,
Yeah.
Pliosaur Anatomy.
Thank you.
And we will look forward to discussing the skeletal structure in a bit more depth, where it came from, those sorts of things,
Mhm.
and how it compares to us in the next episode. This has been Understanding Pliosaurs with Dr. Judith Sassoon. Thank you.